Yo, there we go. All right. Checking to make sure our audio levels are good. Hang on. Oh, it probably doesn't help that that's muted. All right, we should be live. Let's see. There we go. Just checking. Just make sure. Come in, people. Water is fine. Welcome back to Trad Chat Live. Hang on. Yep, there we go. Goodness. Is that how I sound? Great. All right, we're in good business. Cool. Stream is looking good. People looking good. All right, we're gonna let it populate a little bit here. Hello, people who are coming in. Welcome back to another Friday stream. Trad Chat Live. Trad Chat Live. Say that 3 times fast. Hope you guys are doing well. I'm trying to give up some more regular content throughout the week and also, of course, on Great Fridays here. So if you'd be so kind already, hit a like and get those view counts up. Share with some friends. Hey, this is what we're doing today. Yo, today's gonna be a great episode. I'm very happy to round out this week. It's been a great week, and it's nice to be able to spend it with all of you guys. We're gonna talk about, well, let me tell you maybe the purpose of Trad Chat Live. Very simple. This is, I think, a really great space just to be able to talk about stuff we've seen through the week, to ask me questions or to get questions also from you listeners and viewers. But also it's to talk about things that have gone on through the week or maybe the last couple of weeks in culture and politics and movies, in kind of whatever floats the boat. So if you're in chat, go on and say hello. It'd be good to have you guys. By the way, I hope you've checked out my last video, which was a question of, is it the end of Pope Francis? And even if the answer is no, a question on legacy. I thought it was a really interesting thought, and I would love to get your comments on it indeed. But yeah, man, we're gonna have some real fun conversations. Let me try to queue up some of the stuff I saw. The big question, of course, the one that we're going to really talk about, is Donald Trump the new Napoleon Bonaparte? The media kind of lost their ever-loving minds this week, and a lot of people have had some questions because, not Napoleon, but Trump did put out a tweet that was very interesting. He quoted Napoleon, and let me pull up the quote right here. Donald, just Trump quotes Napoleon, which is a quote that I've, of course, come across, and Washington Post is freaking out about it. Democracy dies in darkness and all this kind of stuff. But I actually think it's a case of the left eating itself. And we're going to kind of break that down because, as you guys might know, I really like Napoleon. I think Napoleon is great. Sometimes, maybe 70% of the time, great. And was he a dictator? Yes and no. As in, was he more of an absolute monarch than the Bourbons before him? Not necessarily, I would say. In fact, there was a lot of meritocracy, of course, that Napoleon gave over to not just the French Empire, but not everything of the Code Napoleon, the sort of civic and other sort of laws that he had as a heart of what made the French Empire the empire at the time. Not all of them were bad. And I think you'd probably rather live in post-revolutionary Napoleonic France than maybe some Bat Canyon Spain or something. I guess it kind of depends, right? If you're a really devout Catholic, maybe it'd be a little tricky to live under Napoleon because he did kidnap the Pope. But for those who don't know, I'm a huge Napoleophile. I don't know what they call him. Not really a Francophile, but I've always loved the Napoleonic Wars, especially that started probably about 15 years ago, actually. I got this video game called Napoleon Total War, as you can imagine. And I would spend the time not just playing the game, which is a great strategy game, but I would also spend a lot of time just reading the encyclopedia and trying to understand how it is that this man has an entire age, an entire war named after him, that he is still an icon, that people instantly recognize him. So I'm reading this again. This is the second time I've read through this book, but this is, sorry, the cover is missing. This is Napoleon the Great by Andrew Roberts. That's how you know that it's been well read. And it's exactly that. It's just a huge biography all about Napoleon. There's a picture of the Empress Josephine here, for instance. It goes through everything you can think of. These are some of his siblings down below. This is the coup d'etat that he had, right? I think the tennis court. No, that was for the revolution. but he did have a coup d'etat. So you might say, aha, Trump's channeling a dictator because Napoleon was a dictator. So before we kind of get into specifically Trump, let me tell you a view of history that I've more and more subscribed to. And I call it kind of the great man of history theory. And it's essentially saying that whether they're good or they're bad, that they are wonderful in the eyes of God, that they're doing the right things, or maybe they're the most wicked people who've ever roamed the earth, human history is shaped a lot by these figures that come up in particular time and circumstances that have a couple different identifiable traits that I'm noticing that will echo across time and space. Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Hannibal Barca, Napoleon, of course. And I think there are some traits embodied in Trump that I see. So let me tell you what some of these traits are. First off, these guys are very highly individualistic and they're charismatic in their own ways. And the reason why we know that they're charismatic is because, let's even talk about Napoleon. The Duke of Wellington said that Napoleon's presence on the field of battle made a difference of 40,000 men. So for those who are suddenly just trying to reach for any historical criticism they can have, Napoleon, for some strange reason, got men to fight and die with him all over Europe. And considering that the Napoleonic Wars was an international war, all over the world. How did this happen? Well, there are a couple of traits I identify, and one of them is what I call the touch of the common man. Napoleon certainly had it. Napoleon would go around to his soldiers and he would check to make sure that everything was okay. He would be very, very attentive to the quality of powder for the artillery, how his grenadier guard were feeling and what they needed, what they didn't need. The soldiers would affectionately listen to the emperor call them my sons every once in a while. And in fact, the old guard, there's a French word for veterans, which essentially translates to old grumblers. And the reason why they were allowed to do this is because if you'd been on certain campaigns, you'd earn your stripes. You were able to even shout out if Napoleon was riding by. You'd be able to shout out to him, whether that's praise or that's a necessity or something. And this was something that for a lot of the powers in Europe, they wasn't that kind of love for the generals or their princes. Of course, there are great exceptions. Tsar Alexander, this boyish czar, certainly is, I think, as far as I can tell, his troops liked him. Wellington, the British had a great respect for, and probably because Wellington did a pretty good job in Spain. Von Mack, I can think of for the Austrians. So again, it was a time where charismatic leaders have always been needed, especially in the realm of statesmanship and of warfare, therefore. And Trump has some of that. That's very true. You could like Trump, you could not like Trump, but you can't deny that there's something that Trump does. And I'm reading The Art of the Deal as well right now. And something I'm noticing is that Trump is not just big picture, lap of luxury, all that kind of stuff. Trump is actually really obsessed with getting a good deal and knowing the people who are going to put things in. This is a reputation he's gained in a lot of his business dealings. And so I do believe that Trump has what I would call the touch of the common man, where you feel like Donald Trump, everyone, we always say this, right? Everyone has an uncle like Donald Trump. You could sit down with him and he'll tell you, whoa, isn't it crazy? The craziest thing I ever saw in my life. And I said, what the hell are these people doing here? And you just kind of like to listen to him ramble a little bit because your uncle's kind of crazy, but he has really cool ideas, but he means well. And he's very much has a great sense of who he is. And again, this great man of history theory doesn't mean that you have to love everything that they do. We could talk about Trump's in vitro fertilization executive order, but fundamentally, well, Trump said a Napoleon quote. He said, "He who saves his country does not violate any laws," which is attributed to Napoleon. I haven't happened across it yet in this book, but there's plenty of other Napoleonic quotes that I could definitely give. And of course, the media jumped all over this because what they're trying to say is that you would destroy the laws of the country and be a dictator for the sake of your own political gain. And surely by hearkening and invoking Napoleon, that is exactly what you're saying. And I find it very strange coming from perhaps the political left, because the political left is purely aligned with the French Revolution, which is one of the worst things and one of the most dangerous revolutions that has ever happened in history, second to the Communist Revolution. But a lot of ills, even inside the church right now, you can attribute directly to the French Revolution. To be fair, Napoleon started off as a Jacobite. Not the most rabid revolutionary that you ever saw, but he was still pretty much on Team Jacobite and was pretty happy about that. So Napoleon kind of later, I guess you could say, mellowed out, and maybe it was his own ambition, but also he was brilliant, even from the gate, even from his schooling. There was just something about him that was particularly unique. Now, the reason why I'm saying that this is a sort of attempt by the media is because it's very strange that, again, Napoleon's supposed to be this worst dictator, but Napoleon is objectively better than the French Revolution. There is a line from Napoleon that I've been really thinking about a lot, and I think that Trump has tapped into this, which is why they absolutely hate him. Napoleon says, and I can get the exact quote up actually, but essentially he says, the French people don't really care about liberté or égalité. They don't care about liberty or equality. They are of the Gallic peoples, and therefore honor is what matters to them. So Napoleon, when he came back into power, one of the things that he did was he instituted the social rankings again. A lot of these had been stripped away, right, during this revolutionary proto-communistic zeal of the French Revolution. Napoleon was fine having orders. Obviously, he became emperor, right? He crowns Josephine empress. He institutes the marshals of France for the top military generals. He has no problem with nobility, whereas nobility had to flee or were executed during the French Revolution. But also, Napoleon did institute a really great a very broadband meritocracy. And that's something that has been kind of cool to read about here. And he did. Napoleon, some of his marshals were the sons of essentially the lower class, and they rose up to be the marshals of France. Whether you like the Bourbons or not, whether you're a restorationist or not, that is simply not something that would have happened in the court of King Louis. I think Trump has kind of those similar sort of ideas. There is an understanding of class and structure that you're kind of getting in the new conservative movement, which is okay. Having different classes, having distinctions between peoples is not a bad thing whatsoever, because the fundamental point of it is that you need everybody in your society to work together. You need people who, in our time, do DoorDash or do Uber or work at a grocery store. You need people who run multi-billion-dollar corporations that interface with the military and with the political class. You need lawyers and judges. You need filmmakers and artists. And so everyone has kind of a role to play. The French Revolution worked very hard to break down distinction. Does this sound familiar? In our own current time, it's not so much been the political revolution that's been something to look at. It's been the cultural revolution. And we've had, especially for the last 20 years in particular, a huge desire to break down every foreseeable barrier whatsoever, often for the sake of power that could come from the left. So for instance, even down to the most fundamental basics like gender and race. These things are wonderful, right? God made man and female, male and female, and how beautiful that is, that we are a sexually dimorphic people. But instead, it's gender doesn't matter. Gender is what you feel, right? And because it's what you feel, men can go into women's bathrooms, and it's the women who get thrown out when they complain. They tried this with race, I saw, and they didn't quite work. But if you remember the Rachel Dolezal case, Rachel Dolezal was the president of a chapter of the NAACP. And if you looked at her, it looked like she had kind of this bad tan and this kind of curly hair. And it turned out that she was a white girl from Iowa. Their parents were like, no, she's been living as a black woman for all this time. And Rachel denied it, said, these aren't my parents. I don't know what y'all are talking about, all that things. But there came a very interesting question when she was outed, which was, if someone can change their gender, could somebody change their race? That was probably the first bulkhead that held. And now we're seeing order it come back into place, right? We're seeing people say, no, there's only two genders. The governor of Maine is about to sue the Trump administration for not following the executive order about two genders and banning men from women's sports. So we'll see how that happens. It's kind of nice to have a return to sanity, but sometimes you do have to crack a few heads. But back to it. So what does Napoleon, first off, mean by this? Napoleon, you have to understand, grew up in a society that had radically undergone a huge shift. Of course, he's from the island of Corsica, so technically speaking, his heritage is more Italian than it is strict mainland French. He apparently had an accent when he finally got to Paris the first time. But nonetheless, this is something interesting because Napoleon becomes not just the sort of protector of what people see as the pride and honor of the French, but he becomes one of the biggest exports of French culture. He, of course, revamps the entirety of the code into the Code Napoleon instead. He revamps how the revolution dealt with very conservative, important parts of society. Napoleon made the Concordat, which restored some rights, at least for the Catholic Church, in 1805, if I remember correctly. And you have to remember, go back to the French Revolution, go back to the Vendée, and we just have a lot of revolutionaries killing Catholics, murdering Catholic priests and Catholic nuns, and of course, many of the laity. Napoleon wasn't interested in that. So during the French Revolution, for instance, Notre Dame turned into the Temple of Reason. And so the revolution was all about the goddess Reason. Napoleon doesn't seem to me to be too terribly interested in religion, as in he's going to now just be a good Catholic and be an emperor in the vein of Charlemagne in that case. But he at least understood that the Catholic faith was integral to the French identity, and it was actually worth protecting. Something that the revolution, again, totally threw out. So is it true then? Is it true that he who saves his country does not violate any laws? The obvious question to ask is, what are the laws that apparently are in jeopardy of being violated? And so if the answer is they're wicked laws, right? Laws from man that are not to be obeyed because their ends are evil, then no. The question is, because there's a few different kinds of law, correct? We have the natural law that is implanted in all of us by the virtue of being human. We have laws of divine revelation. We have, like, the 10 Commandments. We have laws that God has given man to be written on man's heart. And from there comes our great amount of civil laws. We have religious laws, a code of canon law. So if the idea saying here is that Trump is now going to be an autocrat, he's going to be a king and emperor because suddenly not every law makes a lot of sense in the country and laws ought to change, that is a strange argument coming from a fact that we're a nation who changes its laws all the time. We just like I talk about whiplash papacy, I'm getting sick of living in a whiplash presidency where every 4 years we have a little minor civil war, and you have to decide, the government gets to say there are two genders. There's more than two genders, right? This is unfortunately the culture war that we're in right now. But a big thing too is just, let's take a step back at the apparatus. This is something I'm still trying to figure out with Napoleon. Napoleon standardized and modernized a lot of systems. He completely did away with a lot of what was done with the ancien regime, right? That would be the ancient regimes, the Bourbons, who had ruled France for an extraordinarily long amount of time up until the point of the revolution. And, Trent, you're absolutely right. Fake news. Yeah, totally. Napoleon, on one hand, does consolidate power, obviously. He gives his family, for instance, which are kind of lower nobility Corsican, which has no political clout on mainland France, by the way. He gives them a lot of positions of power. He makes his brother Joseph the king of Spain, for instance, when the French go into Spain and I think do one of the death knells for the French Empire under Napoleon. And most of his siblings were relatively they're not incompetent, but they just weren't very good rulers. They didn't have the sort of zeal and smarts that their brother Napoleon had. But at the same time, right, he also, even with that consolidation of power and oftentimes padding out his family into positions, he is very, very good about the meritocracy. Some of his marshals, I'm thinking of Marshal Murat, for instance, goes on, it might be Bernadotte, actually. Actually, I think it's Bernadotte, right? Who becomes king of Sweden, if I remember correctly. We're going to fact check this later, but I apologize real quick if I got that wrong. But essentially, some of his marshals do become the kings of various different countries, and he's trying to always intermarry with various royal bloodlines. He ends up, after his divorce from Josephine, marrying the daughter of the Austrian emperor. So there is kind of a spreading out. And again, if you were a French soldier, you would have been treated better under Napoleon than you would have King Louis XVI, just by the virtue of how promotion suddenly worked and how merit suddenly worked. Goodness, Jordan, how does this all relate back to the fact that these yokels called Donald Trump an autocrat? I have seldom seen a man trying to consolidate power who also wantonly burns it away. So mind you, we have just come off the back that Biden pardoned his entire family, extended family even, and all these peoples who weren't even committed of a crime yet. Does that not violate any law? Oh, for a second, my speaker went, but looks like we're good. Yeah, does that violate any law? No one talks about that all of a sudden. But again, the government is shrinking right now. It's not growing. So the autocratic rule that Trump is apparently doing includes the abolishment of entire departments. If you were a dictator, like, let's just follow this, a very simple question here. if you were a dictator, would it not make more sense to consolidate power, let's say in education? Wouldn't you want to make sure that the states didn't have rights in regards to education and rather be able to spread your own propaganda, your own education through your Department of Education? And if the answer is no, then we got a problem here. If you were a dictator trying to consolidate power, wouldn't you be working harder to make sure, it's one thing they say, well, he's against the free press because he kicked out the Associated Press for not going along with the Gulf of America. But we've been naming and renaming things for a while now, just across. I didn't realize, I still said Mount McKinley. I didn't realize that Obama had changed it to Denali. Here in Colorado, Mount Evans, which is down the road, is now renamed to Mount Blue Sky. And so if you were an organization that said, I'm not going to go along with this, and someone said, well, if you're not going to go along with it, we're not going to persecute you, but you're just not allowed in the media room. I don't quite think that's a war on free speech, especially since look at all the new sorts of media that is going into the press briefing rooms. Suddenly podcasters and bloggers and more small, not yet fully established teams of people. I mean, they have a little bit of a track record, but they're not the Associated Press. They're not the Washington Post. They're not Fox News or anything. Suddenly they are getting a seat at the table. And that's kind of just where our media is moving. By the way, Napoleon was a huge believer in the suppression of the press. So to be clear, this analogy does kind of break down here because Napoleon, for instance, would publish his battle reports and just deliberately lie. If he lost 10,000 soldiers, he'd say that he only lost 2,000. I'm sure this became kind of a meme in the French army. Unfortunately, I'm sure right after the War of 1812 especially. But there were some doozy battles and Napoleon would just downplay and everyone would kind of roll their eyes. As far as we know, the government does actually have some actual governmental outlets, right? That's NPR and a couple other ones where they are on the government dole. But I don't really think that's necessary in the modern era. Is it pertinent, especially in a world where your president or your heads of cabinet or whomever it might be could just take to the internet and say exactly what they're up to? We got to see these things because the government's being slashed left and right. So again, I just don't really see the whole autocrat thing. But finally, another thing I'm going to say is here in America, this might lose some people, but I'm just going to say it. We need to stop immediately associating king. Emperor, I think you could be a little skeptical of, depending. But let's at least start with king. The virtue of a king is not a bad thing. And I know we in America, we love democracy and freedom and liberty, right? And we're good sons of the revolution. But the reality is that we live in a time right now where the executive, the legislature, and the judicial have had more power concentrated unto themselves than at any other time in history. There is more harm or good, I suppose, but let's just say harm because it's the government. There's more harm that the government could do now than at any other time in history. If you lived under an absolute monarch, if you lived under Louis XVI, at the very least, your fundamental basics of what it means to be human wouldn't be violated. We live in an era now where we don't know how to define what a woman is. So yeah, I love being an American. I'm very proud to be an American. I certainly wouldn't want to be of any other country. But even as a Catholic, we have to remember, fundamentally, we are subjects to a king, right? We celebrate the feast of Christ the King for a reason. Christ is not just a just king, not just a good king. He's the just king. He is the good king. So it shouldn't be scary to us, the idea of monarchy. I've talked about this a lot on my channel. I could understand, I think how monarchy is probably the most natural disposition of people. The reason I say that is because we don't run our lives in any other fashion. You don't run your business as a pure democracy. That would be ridiculous. You might run your business as a constitutional republic of sorts if you have a board of directors or something like that. But fundamentally, you might even run it most likely as a constitutional monarchy. There is somebody who is the CEO, right? The president of the company. And then there's your Knights of the Round Table underneath. And these are people who, God willing, by their experience and by their wisdom, have earned a seat at the table. And now they're ready to take on the decisions for your company. In your marriages, you might run this as there is a hierarchy in marriage. There's a hierarchy in the family life. But what husband would ever not listen to the prudent advice of his wife? So yes, in terms of the hierarchy, yes, a man is a king of his castle, and that's something that should be respected more, especially if you're trying to have a traditional marriage. But it doesn't mean that your wife is a peasant. Your children might be peasants, but chances are your wife isn't. Instead, your wife if you're a husband, your wife should be your great counsel. Your wife should be your board of directors. You should listen to the prudence of your wife and take that into consideration, lest you get a tyrant, lest you get a dictator. So again, it's just very interesting to me that we pretend that everything is saving democracy, man. We've been doing that for the past 100 years. Woodrow Wilson's who to blame for this one, because Woodrow Wilson used the term make the world safe for democracy after we won World War One, or kind of won. It wasn't as conclusive as it should have been, right? Because World War II is right around the corner. But ever since then, it's like you talk about Ukraine, you talk about the election of Trump, you talk about anything else in the world, and suddenly it's this danger to democracy, which is why I like what JD Vance did, right? JD Vance goes over to Germany and he sits down with all those heads of states and essentially tells them that for this love of democracy they all are supposed to have, they're not acting very democratic. They seem to be more afraid of their people, especially in Germany, which is having their national election coming up. They tend to be more afraid of their people than they are at least listening to their people. Again, I think it's things tend towards a particular point. Absolute power corrupts absolutely, they say. So for anybody in the sort of role that Trump has to dismantle these sort of wheels of power is very, very interesting. And the fact that the conversation here is that somehow he's a dictator by doing it, they've also then shifted. They've said, well, maybe he's not the real president, you see. It's Elon Musk. And it's just all propaganda. And it's not even very good propaganda. I could go with good propaganda. 1905 America, we have to expand our empire. So I'm sorry, Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Philippines, at least they had cool uniforms, right? What do these people have anymore? I have no idea. So I think I've done a very good job of explaining exactly what I mean by is Trump the new Napoleon. The answer is no, by the way. Trump is not the new Napoleon because I think that they have some traits that I admire. They have some traits that are not very good. Napoleon was, I mean, all those guys, there is a huge ego because you have to walk around thinking that you are the savior of whatever, whether it's France or mankind or whatever it is, in order to get things done. And Trump refers to himself in the third person. We call the man Napoleon, not Bonaparte. Bonaparte was what they called him in Britain, for instance, as a sort of insult. But somehow we have a whole era named after the man and a bunch of statues and everything reformed. So again, it's a great man of history theory. I think that the left blows it all out of proportion. There's another quote by Napoleon that I like, and I don't think you could probably say it in our federal republic. But if you read something like Charles Colom's Star-Spangled Crown, you could probably get a whiff of it. Napoleon says, "I did not usurp the throne. I found the crown in the gutter and I picked it up with my sword." And then I do believe he says it was the people who placed it on my head. It's kind of a cool line in history. I actually genuinely think that it's true. The revolution, what the left did in revolutionary France was so terrible, and yet it was also so antithetical to what I think is the soul of what makes the French people, that by the time Napoleon came around and offered very, very wide sweeping, but also very to the heart of France sort of reforms, they were hungry for it. There were not widespread revolutions when Napoleon became emperor of the French. How it happened was very interesting too, by the way. There's a long story short, but let's just say that the Directory, that it was a council that ruled France at the time, essentially, and they had their kind of chief minister. It was terribly unpopular. France was just becoming backwards. And there was so much suspicion still from the revolution and everything. It wasn't very difficult for Napoleon to go in, consolidate power, but also be able to appoint people who were going to very wisely utilize that power. He completely revamped how the French Senate worked, for instance. He completely revamped the laws of France. And that was something that I think probably France was for the better of. Again, as a Catholic, I'm torn when it comes to this subject because there's a part of me that's supposed to be a restorationist. There's a divine right that the Bourbons had that the French people lopped off. Was it martyrdom? It could have been. And Napoleon comes up as a pissant usurper. That's a huge problem, right? Because you should be a restorationist. I tend to like Napoleon. I don't like that he kidnapped the Pope. Because of all popes to kidnap, Pius VII didn't deserve it. But I'm glad that he did kidnap it because Pius VII, I think, made the most out of it too. There's a whole history there. Let me read some comments here. Some say Trump is like Charlemagne or the German Emperor Kaiser Wilhelm II due to politics and personality. I did talk a little earlier, about these great men of history sort of theory. I don't really know. I know a little bit about Charlemagne, and I don't know about Kaiser Wilhelm II, his policies in and of themselves, because I really like the history of the First World War, but I've not really done any history of the German crown leading up to it. That should totally be my next thing. I would love to hear how he's like Charlemagne. I don't know if, I mean, this is the tricky thing. I'm just trying to identify some traits I've seen amongst different leaders throughout history. Here's another example. Julius Caesar. Isn't it really interesting that in our freedom loving democracy, Caesar is painted as the good guy, and the senators who killed him, Brutus and Cassius and Mark Antony, are painted as the bad guys. Yes, I know Mark Antony didn't technically stab him, but you understand the point. So low is this betrayal by the senators that in Dante's Inferno, the three great traitors of the world, Brutus, Cassius, and Judas, Brutus, and Cassius, are in Satan's mouth. If you look at that famous Doré wood carving, you can actually see their legs dangling out. Well, that's weird, right? Because you think that we should hate the fact that Julius Caesar became a dictator, right? He usurped the rules and regulations and the honor, you would say, of the French Republic. He declares the French Republic, Lordy Jordan, of the Roman Republic. In fact, it becomes the Roman Empire, right? And this continues on after Caesar's death with his adoptive son, nephew Octavius, right? Caesar Augustus. So why don't we hate Caesar? Caesar had, again, the touch of the common man. The people loved Caesar. You see a glimpse of this in Julius Caesar's play, but this is, again, based upon the history. You have the great speech by Mark Antony in Shakespeare's play, which is, but Caesar was ambitious and Brutus is an honorable man, right? And essentially what it's showing is that Caesar, for whatever reason, and there's a lot, restored much honor to the Roman Republic. His cross the Rubicon moment was not met with the great resistance from the people that the Senate was really hoping that it would be. And so Caesar does become emperor. Now he's elected emperor, right? But he becomes emperor by the behest of the people. It obviously wasn't all widespread because then the Roman Civil War breaks out shortly thereafter. But nonetheless, the people loved Caesar. Very quickly, that was something that was ingrained in all of Western civilization. Trump has that trait as well. Napoleon had that trait, where you see it with Trump, right? If you go back and you analyze the 2016 election versus now, one thing that's crazy is in 2016, the political class really did hate Trump. He was coming in, this guy from the outside who wasn't going to work with all the systems that were in place. And even coming from where I came from, which is deep red Republican land, you would get your congressman or you would get some senator come down and occasionally they'd make some speech about how they don't want to make sure Obama doesn't take our guns and we love babies. And they'd go back to Washington and they do absolutely nothing. You look at the kind of spinelessness now of guys like John McCain and Mitt Romney and George Bush. And I remember people really liking them back then. So it wasn't just something imagined. That was very, very important. Trump came in and I think painted a dark picture. He said essentially that we're losing this cultural battle, and whether you like it or not, I'm going to institute things that might be uncomfortable around polite dinner conversation, but are going to be true. And the people loved that. And the political class, if you were educated, right, if you had a college degree, if you if you watched CNN or something, you were supposed to hate this. This is terrible, whatever. Now in 2024, the people have approved of Trump. They like what he's doing. They obviously voted for him, not just in the electoral vote, but in the popular vote. And now the political class, that which remains, Trump went to the Republican Party had a huge civil war from 2016 to 2020. And Trump emerged victorious, which was extremely surprising. And I think that if anyone has any political sensibilities about them, they're going to definitely want to analyze how this exactly happened in our particular political climate. How did the conservatives, who went from being the butt of the jokes and everything, actually become kind of the cultural hipsters is a fascinating thing to do. Napoleon did too. Napoleon had the touch of the common man. He was loved naturally by his soldiers because they felt like he was one of them. There are vignettes of Napoleon putting himself in harm's way, and it works, right? So when Trump, has his bullet go through his ear and he stands up and he goes, "Fight," I thought about, this is gonna sound so silly. There's a great painting of Napoleon. Again, great propaganda. I love a good piece of propaganda. There's a great piece of Napoleon, and it's at his battle at is it Arcole or is it Lodi? It's one of those two. And if someone knows it, maybe it's Marengo even. It's early Napoleon, so it's like when he was like happening. He had that long hair, kind of chiseled jawline looking thing. But anyway, what happened is that the French were being beaten, and Napoleon, everyone's getting their horses shot out from under them. It's bayonet fighting. It's nasty, nasty stuff. Napoleon actually grabs a flag and leads a charge over this bridge. And so there's this very famous painting of Napoleon with this flag. I gotta figure out what its name is real quick before it loses me. Napoleon with flag painting. Yeah, I mean, I understand I should share my screen. It's a very, there it is. It's at Arcole. So it's a great painting. I'm sure that many of you have seen it. I'll probably put it in the thumbnail next. But it's exactly that. It's Napoleon storming a bridge, leading the troops, and the French ended up being victorious during the Italian campaign. That would have been in 1796. And again, the soldiers loved him because he put himself out there in harm's way. Whether you like Trump or not, that's not the point. Whether you like him or not, it was the smartest thing he could have done politically. And I think a little bit of providence that his head wasn't blown off, but him to stand up and say fight, because all of his rhetoric before was, they're coming after me, they're fighting for me. Again, you don't have to like him. I like him, but you don't have to. You can understand why people probably would follow that, why people would be inspired by that. We have a huge problem right now in our country, friends. And I actually think the administration is riding it because image is everything. Image is extremely important. I work in the line of film, right? So image, especially in regards to my work in the church, is extraordinarily important. We choose very carefully what images we put in front of the audience because we want to put our best foot forward, certainly as Catholics, but also just as good filmmakers. And so part of image is that you want to convey particular messages. It doesn't all have to be lies. You just want to make sure that you are accentuating something that's probably naturally there. Trump standing up and putting his fist up in the air overnight became an international sensation. I was seeing TikToks in Ghana of these kids reenacting the assassination attempt, and that was the image that they did. I should get a print out and hang it on my wall or something. The moment I saw that, I thought of that line that it's Balin says, right, in The Hobbit, there's one I could call my king. And maybe that's not in Tolkien's writing, but it's in the movie, and that's like the only decent line in the movie. And you see that, you say, well, no matter what, this conveys a sort of strength, and it conveys a sort of individuality, and that's something that the great men of history have. It's obviously not just restricted to men. There have been some fantastic queens in particular who have stood up when the call was needed, and they absolutely did wonderful. So yeah, I mean, I like Napoleon. I feel like the media's attacks are extremely low childish. It's clearly by people who haven't thought this one through, because implicitly these are the same people who love the French Revolution, and the French Revolution's evil. Thank God Napoleon came around. Not perfect. Probably still would have been better for the French to have a Bourbon on the throne. There certainly would have been less bloodshed. And obviously, Napoleon had some huge drawbacks, which Trump also has. Napoleon caused a whole war across all of Europe and the world, for heaven's sake. The War of 1812 was a spinoff of the Napoleonic Wars, and that was inconclusive. So yeah, there were some evils. Napoleon kidnaps a pope. So, the power hungry kind of thing, I totally get. Steve, now we need him to convert to Catholicism. Yo, this is true. And actually, this is a good kind of pivot point. I just want to very briefly touch on this. But obviously, a lot of you have seen Trump's executive order about the expansion of in vitro fertilization. Let's see, IVF sort of, that's what's been spread, right? That IVF should be covered by insurance, that it should be more accessible, all these things. And that's a great evil, and it's unfortunate. Now, before we get into that weeds, I'm not a theologian, right? So I'm just expressing the general understanding of the Catholic Church here. And there are priests far greater than me that I do radio shows with who can go more into depth. What I would say is, as a Catholic who is deeply concerned about the political and cultural future of our country, and who is very deeply concerned about the suspension of embryos by the millions in vats, what it feels like, I would say this. I don't think people have a very good grasp on why IVF is evil. And I think that is probably motivated because the motivations for IVF are different at least they seem different, right, than the motivations for abortion. Now, at the end of the day, this all comes down to the same thing, which is that God creates male and female. God creates sex and sexuality. These are beautiful things, and there are particular things that need to be protected inside that, especially when it comes to children. I'm adopted, right? I am the product, on one hand, of a failed family. I'm a product of people's passions overriding their judgment, because sex should be for a husband and a wife who are married. It should be for the procreation of children and the unity, of course, and the mutual enrichment of the spouses. On the flip side, I'm a huge believer that adoption needs to be streamlined and encouraged, because my parents paid a lot of money for all of us siblings. And for every one adoption that goes through, there's like 3 that just in different stages just don't work out. And that's very frustrating. So I want to start by saying I have a really great sympathy for couples who are trying to conceive, especially nowadays, right, where fertility rates are so low. They're just trying to conceive. They just want children. And this seems like the regular option to have one if you can't have a child by normal means. I went to a fertility doctor once, and it's weird. It's so widespread. You don't even think about it. What would you consider IVF? Okay, here's some pamphlets about IVF. And you have to stick to your guns and say, well, no. So why is IVF evil? Here's just the big and skinny, right? And I think that Trump and a lot of these people who are pro IVF, I want to say that they mean well. I don't think that all of them are just in purely for genetically customizing your child. Some of them are, and I read a Not the Bee article that I'll talk about here in a second. That's kind of funny and also really, really sad at the exact same time. Essentially, this woman went in for in vitro fertilization, and she customized her sperm donor, essentially selected him out. And already we're seeing this terrible sci-fi nature of this problem. And she gave birth to this kid who was like an entirely, different race, all that kind of stuff. So what happened is that the clinic had accidentally messed around the different, I don't even know how to say this, like the different sperm. And here it is. This is on Not the Bee. After undergoing IVF through coastal fertility specialist in Georgia, Christina, there's your first problem, Murray, gave birth to a baby boy in December of 23, but upon seeing the baby, it was clear to Murray that this was not a baby created by her chosen sperm donor. She purposely chose a donor with features similar to hers, with blonde hair and blue eyes, but the baby was black. Well, you upgraded. Black people are cool. But that totally is teasing. Guys, do you not see the problem? Isn't that weird? Like before we get into just the evil of it, because we're playing God. Look at this. You go in there. It's like ordering off a menu. You go in there. You select what kind of baby you want. The thing I think about it is this. I grew up on a farm. And so sometimes if you go to a zoo or maybe they're farm animals, you think of artificial insemination, which is a strange thing to say out of my mouth, but here we are. And it's just gross. It's a gross process. It's a gross thought. Is this not what we're doing with IVF? So what they do is there'll be multiple embryos, multiple children created, and then they'll try to essentially implant a couple of embryos or one embryo inside the uterus, and hopefully that's going to take. But again, for every one successful IVF, there are potentially tens or who knows how many babies who are killed in order for that process to go through. I understand the motivation. I think children are a wonderful, beautiful thing. Those who are conceived via IVF still have dignity and value. And of course, they are made in the image and likeness of God. But we are just playing with this terrible science thing. And the Catholic Church is kind of standing alone on this point. The Catholic Church we are the ones who are saying this is evil because, you want to have a beautiful, lovely marriage between husband and wife. And there's a natural process that God created. And yes, of course, there are things we can help accentuate chances of fertility and these things, but sex and procreation are not scientific aspects here. They are not science experiments. And ironically, it's strange that in a world that's getting ever more crunchy, this is something that the Catholic Church is standing in a very true and good traditional stance on. Steve, I've noticed a lot of pro-life pioneers, especially Catholic ones, don't mention IVF very often. Yeah, and even as you're hearing me try to go through it a little bit, I don't have all the terminology down. It's difficult to talk about. You could outline why it's wrong, but I think it's because of where the motivation is coming from again, Steve. I think that we've fought so hard with abortion, and it's so obvious why abortion is evil, because if life begins at conception, if that moment there's another human being at the very early stages of their development, it's a question that biology can really take in. Nobody is questioning. Well, that's not true. People might agree with that. They might say, I do believe that life begins at conception. I think that children are beautiful and wonderful, but a lot of times it's just not informed about how destructive or scientifically sterile IVF actually is. Again, guys, we are talking about millions of babies in their earliest stages of development who are in cryo sleep, essentially. It's really, really sticky. And I don't have the terminology because I do understand that frustration, that pain of a couple wanting to conceive their own child. And I love adoption. Obviously, I'm very grateful to my parents, but I understand the impetus, right? That's a natural impetus for humans. You want to procreate and you want your offspring to probably look like you or come from your blood, right? Or it's our blood. So it's terribly unfortunate. Yeah, I don't think that Catholics have found the right kind of voice yet, because it is a needle to thread that's going to be a little bit different than abortion. With abortion, you can talk about there's a beauty to life, even if it's life conceived in the midst of the worst of circumstances, or if it's conceived amongst the most difficult aspects of life, financially, economically, isolation from the family, that sort of thing. There's a lot of clinics set up to help mothers, single mothers, and a lot of clinics to help set up about choosing life for your baby. I think this is one that happens just in such a different manner that we have to find our footing. But that being said, there are just two quick things on this point. Number one, as Catholics, we cannot let the pure be the enemy of the good. So there are some conservatives and certainly Catholics. And it's not saying that it's not right. It's not right. It's an evil. Okay. But I think that it's probably better than not that Catholics are trying to still work in government and Trump's administration, because you want to make sure that we have that ear. And we're fighting for all of those babies who are just there in the earliest stages of development, right? We're fighting for that's what it means to be pro-life. It's from conception to natural death. That is a Catholic position right there. And I think now we have to say from natural conception to natural death, right? We probably have to pick that mantra up. But again, I think it's walking with a lot of people. And here's another thing. With all the fertility issues, we go immediately to this very clinical, very scientific environment, which is good. You should have some good science behind it. But I've discovered that there are a lot of NAPRO doctors, for instance, right, who are just trying to educate Catholics in particular, but a lot of people about different fertility sort of treatments and options. Couples that are having trouble conceiving, it doesn't mean it's that way forever, or that IVF, which is extremely expensive, by the way, is the only solution. And so there are solutions out there. Again, I would 100,000% recommend adoption, and being adopted myself, I think that's so beautiful. I'm so grateful to my parents. So I can't imagine where I'd be if they didn't do that. And I know that it was such a pain. I've talked to my mom and my dad about this. I know that it really hurt for them to get married as this young Catholic couple and yet not have the ability to bear children of their own. But my mom says that the moment I surrendered that to God, God gave me children, and she gave them 4 of us. Through blood, sweat, and tears, and I'm eternally grateful for that. So there's that as well. Generally speaking, fertility rates are going down, testosterone levels are going down, but there's a lot of not, I would say, terribly laborious things that guys can do to help fix that if fertility issues are a little bit more on your side. You talk to a good NAPRO doctor, a good Catholic doctor, and essentially it's like zinc, a bunch of different supplements, lose weight, work out. Who'd have thunk, right? Be more manly and you might have a chance. So yeah, I've just thought about that a little bit. I'm not the kind of authority for it. Whatever. Embryonic stem cells are evil, but too expensive for the public. The church has spoken against it, but you don't hear it often. Once a process becomes cheaper, it might become too late to speak against. I don't know, man. I grew up and I feel like embryonic stem cells were very, very much talked about. And I know that I don't remember the other term for stem cells, for instance, that don't kill babies, embryos in order to do it, but where you can take it off the umbilical cord or something like that. But I do know that that is another thing that's being more understood. I think you can have a very holistic system here. I think you can have a very pro-life system here. I don't think Trump is a complete lost cause, but I don't think, Catholics have just been very good about talking about the issues like IVF because it feels kind of new. Honestly, I feel like 5 years ago, I just never talked about it. It felt still very sci-fi. But man, things are accelerating so fast that if I was a sci-fi writer, I'd be out of the job right now. Thank you, Steve. That's beautiful. May God bless your family. Yeah, it was a very beautiful thing that my parents did. And I am very, very grateful to them and to all of these people. I just met a good filmmaker out in St. Louis recently who him and his wife adopted. And I also think they have one that's born naturally. So that's beautiful. And 10 out of 10, I would hope to recommend, definitely. I think it should be streamlined more. But we can work with this, Papists. We can really work with this, because I think that right now, if we can convince people to stop being a pro-death culture, I think we can hone in on really understanding the depth of what it means to be pro-life, and also to have the Catholic position, the true position on what sex and marriage and family life entails. So, but those there, I mean, man, there's just some naysayers out there, and I get it. It sucks. It sucks when a political leader that you like does an action that is morally evil, which is to expand the destruction of babies in this case. But let's not make the pure be the enemy of the good here. Let's just keep crusading, keep taking up the fight. Being jaded and cynical doesn't help. And this is such a conservative trait. I mean, like, traditional trait as well. There's a feeling when you're a traditionalist of some sort or another that culture is always dying. It wasn't as good as when I was growing up, that kind of stuff. And so the moment you get a whiff of that, there's so many people who just pick up their ball and go home. I'm not doing that anymore. I'm not doing that in the church. I'm not doing that in the realm of politics. We have to be warriors sometimes. And that means that we have to be able to have these tough conversations with our compatriots, with people who we probably agree with 90% of the time. And that 10% does very much matter. IVF very much does matter here. But we have a lot of enemies at the gate still. There are so many people in this country who have been, whether by their own sort of their willing actions, or maybe they've been brainwashed for something, they're just living lives and promoting lives that are just so evil to what God's design is. And I'm not saying the people are evil, but even in my own family, right, gender confusion has unfortunately affected. And it's very sad because it doesn't make people happy, because it's not true, right? So you might feel good for a time, but even this little exchange that Trump got into today with the governor of Maine, there's only two genders. Why is this so complicated? Well, now we're going to have to litigate this and fight this in court and all this stuff. It's sad. You don't want to live in a world like that. Say what you will about the worst of the autocrats before. They weren't confused about these sorts of things. But we have to keep picking up that weapon every day. You pray the rosary, you love your family, you make sure that you can provide for yourself and your little ones, and then you pick up your shield and you stand in the wall, right? You stand in the shield wall and you continue to push back against this darkness. Us quitting now is not going to help. Us saying, well, this is it, it's over, America, is not going to help. Us saying, yep, it's all just going to hell in a handbasket and there's nothing you can do about it, and if you still support Trump or if you still likes this or that, that's not good enough, is not going to help. It's not to say that you can't have opinions, and it's not to say that your opinions are not right, but I think that we need to work on being as wise as serpents and as gentle as doves. And I think we got the gentleness down for the last X amount of decades, but the wisdom part sometimes is lacking here. So let's not lose hope over this IVF debacle. This is what the rosary was made for. This is what our sacraments are made for. You got to understand that Christ is king. I said that earlier, right, in the broadcast, talking about Napoleon and Trump. Who cares who sits on the throne of America? Who cares at the end of the day on that front? Because Christ is Lord of all. He's already known the entire plan of human salvation. And so we have a choice to make. We either conform ourselves with that, which means that, yes, we speak out when something is evil, when something is wrong, but also we don't tie ourselves in knots being worried about the temporal things of this world, because Christ is reigning. And at the end of the day, we have an obligation to him as our king to stay true to that. So just some thoughts there. This has been fun, man. I'm glad that, thank you all for kind of tuning in and stuff. I think I usually like to keep these about an hour, but if there's any questions or any comments y'all want to make in the chat, I would definitely want to hear from you guys. It's good to get a little bit of commentary going on. And by the way, if you've stopped by, this is your first time, maybe you're watching right now, hey, don't forget to please give the video a like and also to subscribe to the channel. Like I said, if you haven't already, do check out and pray, of course, for Pope Francis. Pope Francis has now spent a week in the hospital. This could be it, friends. And there is a part of me, admittedly, that, well, it's not that I want him to die. What I want is I want God's will to be done. Because if Pope Francis dies as a Catholic, if he receives the sacraments, if he receives extreme unction, you can be bittersweet about that. That's how we should all desire to die as Christians. And while I've talked on this channel a lot and in my personal life about the kind of damage and the kind of hurt that Pope Francis has done, I still hold him to be the Holy Roman Pontiff, and I don't wish him any ill. Quite the opposite. I actually wish that he would get better. And if this is the hour of his death, I do pray that he dies as a Christian. And if it's God's will that he gets better and that he stays on the papal throne for as long as God permits, well, then that is God's will, and I will accept that too. I don't consider myself an enemy of Pope Francis. I've been critical, but there are certainly more critical channels. But, you know, at the end of the day, this is what happens to all of us. Pope is 88 years old now. You know, my grandfather's 93 and is in better shape than him. So we just got to pray. You know, if you haven't already, say a quick prayer. Just, God, your will be done. But if it is in your will to heal Pope Francis and to keep him here on this earth, then let that be thy will. And if it's your will that this is his final hours, that he may receive the sacraments and that he may believe unto the Lord Jesus Christ and be saved, as the book of Acts says, and that also be his will carried out. And then also that the next pope may be a good and holy pope, one who loves the church and loves Jesus Christ, and probably, I would say, smooths out a lot of the discord that has happened between a lot of different parts of the church that's unfortunately happened throughout the last 10, 12 years, however long. Francis has been on for a while. I was a senior. I'll tell you guys a quick story. I was a senior in high school when Pope Benedict stepped down. And what happened is, as the ground of resident Catholic in my language arts class, my teacher was, doing something, and he paused. He said, Pope Benedict stepped down. What does this mean? And everyone kind of looked at me, and I said, a pope hasn't stepped down in a very long time. I probably didn't even know that was possible. And then, of course, however long it took, not terribly long, Pope Francis emerged, and people said, well, what do you know about him? And I said, I know absolutely nothing except he's a Jesuit. And at that time, I'd started to recognize that that's probably doesn't bode very well. But there are some very good Jesuits who I've met. And so now we're here. Steve, I love your comment here. I think any practicing Catholic who takes the faith seriously has been critical of Pope Francis. Yeah, I'd probably agree with you. Not to mention, this is actually a very good pontificate in one way, because we've rediscovered how to be critical of a pope and still be a Catholic in good standing. Our Renaissance ancestors, those people had that down pat. At one point, the Pope excommunicated all of Venice, Florence. Chat, you have to forgive me. Like, my historical facts are falling in. I think it's Florence. Let me just find out. Pope excommunicates Florence. Yep. The Pope Gregory XI excommunicated all the members of the government of Florence and placed the city under interdict in 1376, which banned religious services. Can you guys imagine that? Goodness gracious. So I don't know what the Florentines did. I haven't read deeply on their history, but Florence stayed Catholic after that was lifted, if it was even legitimate in the first place. I'm sure God really rolled his eyes at that one. So just a little bit of history, but yeah, just pray for the Pope pray for Pope Francis, pray for Donald Trump, for heaven's sake. We should be praying for our leaders, those whom God has given to rule over us, that they be just and good rulers. And if they are not just and good rulers, then yeah, we have a right to suffer well and every once in a while do what the Vendee did, which is to resist unto the last as Catholics. But I think I'll probably end the stream here. It's been a really fun hour. Thanks for talking with me all about Trump and Napoleon, and we got through some different topics, but I very much appreciate you guys. Thank you so much for watching. This has been so cool. 2 years ago, I had 1,000 subscribers, and now we're just on the cusp of 8,000. We're so close there. And I've just been so grateful for everyone who has subscribed and everyone who has kind of helped take this journey with me. I started this podcast years ago with my buddy Rudy Carlos. At the time, I just discovered the Traditional Latin Mass, and I just wanted to talk about it. As you can imagine, I don't shut up a lot of the time. So I was just very, very excited. I still am. It helped really deepen my faith, and that's why, of course, it's called the Glad Trad Podcast. And I'm very, very grateful to all of you who've given the comments and some of your stories, and have been able to share a little bit about yourselves. And we're all brothers and sisters in Christ together. And that's a beautiful thing. That's something I don't say enough. I'm getting all soppy-eyed about this. But seriously, it's a really, really wonderful way to talk and to connect with people. So, hey, do please pray for me. I am very much a sinner, and I do need and I do appreciate all of your prayers. Don't forget to like the stream and to comment. We'd love to hear some of your stories. If you think Trump's the new Napoleon, let's go ahead and hear from it. Hey, give us a like too, if you don't mind. And of course, if you want to support the channel further, please check out our Patreon, patreon.com/GladTribePodcast, or become a YouTube channel member. Just great ways to help support the show.